our last technical session on sustainable jobs. You met me earlier today. I'm Stefano Caria, and we have two great presenters, both of them in person, so that's fantastic. We started 15 minutes late, about 15 minutes late, but we only have two presentations, so that should give us roughly the same amount of time that the other sessions got. So we'll get 15 minutes per session. If there are burning questions, you can ask them right away, but otherwise I'll just wait and collect questions at the end, like people have done in the previous sessions. So without further ado, I'll let the first speaker, Tewodros Gebrewolde, our very own from the IGC, talk about sustainable jobs, and then we'll move to a second presentation about migration. Teddy, you got a mic?
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to talk about resilient jobs to resilient people who are able to stay this long for this session. So thank you very much for staying. I think once the presentation, so let me just give two notices. First of all, Ato Nugusu, the State Minister of Labor and Skills, he was going to chair this session, so he sent his apologies. So you see his name on the agenda, but he was not able to make it. So please accept his apologies. Secondly, of course, today's session, I think, goes without saying. I don't want to repeat it, but I want to remind everyone that what I'm going to talk about is I'm just going to be fishing for ideas. This is not an end result presentation of papers results, but what we would like to engage in, especially on firms and labor on the labor market. So I'll just be just throwing away some ideas and give some context about why we think these are important things to consider. So I'll try to be very quick. I don't want to take time away from if you want to escape traffic in the late afternoon. So there are three complementary policy areas that we were considering, because what we wanted to focus on is when it comes to sustainable jobs, there is a firm angle, and then there is a labor market angle. Within the firm angle, we wanted efficient firms that would generate high quality growth, because that's how we can envisage jobs to be sustainable. They have to be high quality. And we want firms to be efficient in order to be resilient to some of these climate shocks. So we have proposed three sort of complementary policy areas. So the first one is firm upgrading, and that is identifying strategic sectors for clean growth. And there are some movements within the Ethiopian context of moving towards that in that direction. The second one would be harnessing trade and FDI policies to ensure that we benefit from some of the climate policy, the global climate related advantages, opportunities that countries have, and also sort of mitigate some of the challenges when it comes to trade and FDI, and also maintain our competitiveness. That's a key, that's an important factor, because if we, in our attempt to become green, if we sort of forego our competitiveness, that would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we're not. So ideas about what kind of things to study to make sure we maintain our competitiveness in the trade arena. And of course, finally, what happens to labor markets in terms of skills that we need in a continuously changing world, and what sort of policy measures and resilience to shock, some of the issues that were being raised in the morning by both Stefano and others that we need to look out for. So on the firm upgrading one, I think, of course, strategic sectors for green growth, non-smoke, what are called non-smokestack industries, is important. Both in the 10-year development plan and in the homegrown economic reform programs, there are the new sectors that are included. Two of them are non-smokestack sectors, ICT and tourism, and these sectors are receiving increasingly more attention by the government, the policymakers for incentivizing. This is a good thing because there will be an increasing move towards these non-smoke stack sectors by firms. An important issue would be that what kind of incentives can we put in place for to incentivize firms to upgrade to these non-smoke stack sectors. The other important issue here when we talk about firm upgrading is the use of energy. Here and in the morning, Stefano was talking about it. The amber line that you see with the biggest share is the use of energy, biomass share of use of energy by firms. So there is still a lot of opportunity, although we sort of pride ourselves to be using hydropower for our industries. There is a lot of room for us to move more and more towards away from using biofuels. And then, so that's another important area that we think is worth considering policy-wise. What sort of policy support incentives can we use to move towards a more clean energy source? So in all of these, a key ingredient would be technology adoption. Of course, there is sufficient evidence in other countries that research and development, especially in clean technologies for firms, has had good results. Paper by Asemoglu and others show that using both subsidies and negative environmental taxes together is the way to go. It gives more results compared to just using either environmental tax or just subsidies for R&D. So using both is important. So we want to make sure that whether this is true in the case of Ethiopia, can we use these kinds of course, one thing to note is that we have agreed that resource is limited. So whether we have to make sure whether subsidies are feasible in the case of Ethiopia, or in what specific context would subsidies be feasible is an important research question. Skipping the agricultural adaptation part because we covered it partly in the morning. Another important question would be that can we use other tools used in other countries for Ethiopian industries? One is, for example, cap and trade, where firms produce until to a certain extent, to a certain level, and then stop when they meet their sort of production quota, and then trade with other firms that are not able to reach their quota, their capacity. So, sort of trading excess capacity across firms with these kinds of systems will be able to work is another important question that we want to explore. And this is compared to carbon taxes or other measures used to discourage carbon emissions. On the trade and FDI, what we wanted to focus on is maintaining competitiveness is key. We want to ensure about that. One comparative advantage that countries like Ethiopia that are hydro-rich is that production can move with increasing global changes in trade regimes. Production can increasingly move towards countries with clean energy. So we may have some comparative advantage in attracting firms for production, and what kind of systems need to be in place for us to attract that. And also we have what kind of institutional mechanisms need to be put in place for a country like Ethiopia to earn carbon credits. Earning carbon credits has been very challenging for countries like Ethiopia, even with policymakers increasingly becoming skeptical on whether it is sort of a technical or other reasons that are that is resulting in countries not earning more carbon credits. There is the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU that penalizes goods for their carbon emissions, and we want to develop research on how we can escape these kinds of penalizing issues. Now, we want to make sure that in agriculture, for example, we need to stay competitive. So any technological adoption that we bring in continues to maintain the competitiveness of the agriculture sector, especially in the trade sector, because largely our exports are agricultural, and we want to make sure that they remain competitive. It goes without saying that all the basic constraints that are constraining firms, that are not making firms not competitive, we continue to work on those areas as well, like power, infrastructure, trade regimes, other barriers, bureaucratic, bottlenecks. All of those need to be, need to be addressed. Is our belief. Now, coming to the labor markets, and I'll be very quick in this area. So the first issue in the labor markets is skills. We need to really look at our skill set. So there is enough evidence. First of all, on the ICT sectors, these new sectors we are focusing on, there is an ongoing assessment of skills in the ICT sector, and it's important that we find that what evidence there is on the gap and how we can fill it, because that's one way of building green skills, right? And then we need to also look at other sectors like renewable energy, waste management, and other sectors where we need to start building new skills. And we want to make sure that whether our education sector or our skills institution sectors are ready to kind of provide these skills. There is a lot of gap in even the basic skills, but we need to start from the policy angle, delivering on green skills. Otherwise, would have trouble, benefiting from the opportunities going forward. So there is an opportunity to do more research there. The other important scope is for firms to train as they upgrade, because existing firms will have to upgrade, and when they upgrade, they will need their workers to catch up to the recent technologies, to green technologies. So we want to make sure that firms are training, but there is a very high cost of training that firms involved in firms training their workers. This is well evidenced, especially on the apprenticeships, internship programs. One of the important constraints that firms raise is that it's very expensive for firms to train their workers, because training has costs and risks as well. When they are allowing people to use their machines break and things of the sort happen. So we want to really understand what kind of environment would result in better training by firms to workers. And the other important thing is that climate change, environmental changes would result in a restructuring of the labor market. People moving from one place to another, some jobs being destroyed, some jobs being created, and some movement. So we want our jobs matching system, our labor market, to be ready to adjust to these changes. A lot of work has been done in the urban sector. More recently, there is a paper done by the IGC, funded by the IGC, commissioned by the IGC, on skills mismatches. And there is there are a number of findings that are really sobering. I can tell you that, for example, only 40% of applicants have experience, while job vacancies, about 80% of job vacancies. So it's only half of the job applicants have experience when 80% of job vacancies need experience. Whereas a lot of the applicants are overqualified, that just looking at their educational background, are overqualified for the jobs that they're getting. So this is a significant labor market mismatch in Ethiopia. Another important one is that a lot of applicants tend to come from, in that survey, tend to come from the accounting background, whereas a lot of trainers and teachers are highly in demand. So there is that skills qualification mismatch. It's an interesting. So this is for the urban labor market. For the urban labor market, we have some understanding of the skills mismatch, but we also need to understand what's happening in the rural labor markets and how migration would change the structure of the labor market and how we need to respond to these changes. 2 minutes, just 2 slides, if it would change. So the other important issue was raised this morning. I will just touch upon it, and that's the response of jobs to natural disasters, whether some jobs will be destroyed, and how would jobs respond to these shocks. Let me just skip that. We find that, for example, and this is Stefanos and Groom's paper, that some interventions like job loss insurance schemes would result in better welfare for workers. So we need to understand better whether these kinds of interventions can be feasible and scalable as a policy to make jobs more resilient, or to keep people's welfare when there is an event of shocks like climate shocks. And on the informal and informal, Dr. Abdi was raising this morning as well. There is some evidence, previous evidence before, that formal firms have higher capital returns and are more resilient to shocks. We want to understand better these formality, informality, gaps, and how they would respond to shocks. I think I'll just skip the summary slides. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for the great presentation. And I think we're kind of short on time, so let's skip questions for now. You can ask them in 15 minutes time. Anne will tell us about international migration. Anne can.
Hi, thanks for sticking around for the last presentation of the day. My name is Anne Krahn. I'm a PhD student at Tufts University in the US. And I'm excited to share with you today a survey experiment that I have done with a couple other researchers. We're looking at international labor migration in Ethiopia. And this is joint work with Morgan Hardy, who's at NYU Abu Dhabi, and then Christian Meyer, who's at Oxford. Never my slides come up. Should I hit play? Oh, okay. Oh, the impacts of migration channel. Right. I wish I had it memorized so I could just, not quite there yet. That looks good. Okay, great. So like I mentioned, this is a survey experiment. and officially titled The Impact of Migration Channels on Expected Benefits and Migration Intentions here in Ethiopia. So by way of a general introduction, it's generally accepted that international migration is considered a reliable way to generate not only large income gains, but promote economic development. And the primary way that economic development is achieved is through remittances, which exceeded $800 billion across the globe in 2022. Despite large flows of international movements of people for labor market reasons, there are recent and rising concerns about the financial, physical, and psychological costs of migration, particularly when migration is through informal channels. And by that, I mean without the proper documentation in certain countries, without having gone through the proper legal channels. And so these are recent concerns. In Ethiopia in particular, there's a long history of international labor mobility, and there's been a recent shift from banning out migration to now recognizing benefits and seeking to facilitate and foster secure out-migration. And amidst this background, the high returnee rate, particularly from Gulf states, emphasizes the importance of understanding beliefs about returns from migration through both formal and informal channels. So in this paper, in this broader project, we are aiming to document characteristics, beliefs, and intentions among a representative sample of potential international migrants in Addis Ababa. And we do this by considering the relationship between migration channels, so again, informal and formal channels, and migration intentions. And we do this by using hypothetical job offers to understand how these channels influence migration decision, the overall migration decision-making process. And so more specifically about the data we collect, we conduct a single survey here in Addis between May and July of 2023. We start with a comprehensive representative listing, which my co-authors had spent a lot of time gathering a few years prior. And this is a representative listing of job seekers in Addis. We take for this project a previously unsampled portion of this listing to come up with a representative sample of about 2,500 potential migrants or potential international job seekers. And then we deem a certain portion of these people eligible for the survey for our purposes, which means they're above 18 years old or above 17 years old, and at some point would consider at some point in their lifetime moving to the Middle East for work. And so the number of people who are eligible for our survey are just about 1,800 people. And then we randomize what we consider our treatment, which is a hypothetical job offer in the Middle East through informal means. So there's an informal treatment group, and then a hypothetical formal job offer through formal means. And so we split that as close to 50-50 as we can. And through these treatment groups, we collect beliefs about personal and household benefits, which include expected earnings, expected remittances, et cetera. From two perspectives, if the respondent were to stay in Ethiopia, on the one hand, and hypothetically, if the respondent were to take up the job opportunity and migrate to the Middle East, again, through their assigned treatment group, so formal or informal. We see some interesting sample characteristics, so I'll just start with that. About half our sample is female, the average age is 32 years, and the average respondent in our sample has 13 years of schooling. Interestingly, of course, we're wanting to know about previous migration, history, what people know about migration, et cetera. And we find that 50%, above 50% of our sample has ever lived outside of Addis, and 15% of our sample had ever moved outside the country. The vast majority of this 15% had moved somewhere in the Middle East. And finally, we want to know, of course, about beliefs and intentions about migration. So the average respondent, or the average amount of time that respondents in our sample expect that they would move abroad to the Middle East if they were to, is 5 years. If they were to go, they expect to earn 5 times more in the Middle East than they could in Ethiopia. And they expect that they might remit to their family members or neighbors or friends 3.5 times more than what they would if they were living and working in Ethiopia. So our headline descriptive results from these two treatment samples, we're looking at migration intentions through formal and informal means. And we find a staggering result that if our respondent is assigned to the formal treatment group, 84% of this sample says yes, they would prefer to take this job offer up if it were truly available and move to the Middle East. Compared to those in the informal treatment group, only 34% of people in this group would want to take up an informal job offer through informal means and move to the Middle East if that were the choice available to them. So this highlights there's some motivating factors between the channels that you're offered and your intent to migrate. So some brief descriptive results about a particular subset of our sample that we're interested in is the relatively small portion of people who've ever migrated to the Middle East. So again, this was a small 15% of our sample, but we're interested in knowing how they think about migration because they already have. So compared to non-migrants, previous migrants to the Middle East are much more likely to be female. I don't put numbers here, but this was staggering. So 89% of people who've ever migrated to the Middle East in our sample are women. They're more likely to be older, slightly less education than non-migrants. And importantly, the last three indicate that previous migrants are more likely to be married, have bigger families, and come from larger households. So potentially more people to support and maybe more motivating factor to move abroad. Importantly, we've captured that previous international migrants have almost 2 times the number of social contacts in the Middle East than non-migrants. And these people are more likely to be direct relatives. So this indicates that social networks play a role, which may be an intuitive result, but 2 times is a large magnitude. And wanted to flag that we find that 15%, of the sample of previous migrants, they are 15 percentage points more likely to be unemployed at the time of our survey, which is when they're back in Addis, compared to non-migrants. So this may indicate some labor market frictions upon return to Ethiopia, and that is a realm for future study. So sticking with this the subset of our sample, we want to know if these people have quote unquote correct expectations about migration returns. And so what we mean by that, there's some emerging literature about, do people who have migrated, do they have tempered expectations about earnings, remittances, compared to people who have never migrated and maybe have inflated expectations? So in our sample, we do find that previous migrants are just as interested in migrating to the Middle East, so they might want to go back. But they do expect that they would go about 2 years less than the average respondent in our sample who's a non-migrant. They expect that the migration-related costs of their journey would be 23% less, so they expect that it would cost less than non-migrants. They'd expect to also earn a little bit less in earnings and send less remittances. So those are interesting pecuniary results. And then we also find that this group expects that their personal work satisfaction would be lower than non-migrants. So all of this to say that we see that non-migrants in our sample appear to have inflated expectations of the migration-related costs and the earnings that they would receive if they were to move to the Middle East. And previous migrants have updated their beliefs upon return. So some simple treatment effects that we're looking at here, again, between the formal and informal groups. So compared to those in the formal scenario group, the informal group expects their costs to be higher, expects their earnings and remittances to be lower, and overall, as I alluded to in the bar chart a few slides back, greatly prefer to migrate less often. We also ask about some personal well-being and work satisfaction, and we find that the informal scenario group expects that their personal well-being, work satisfaction, and also their household well-being would be reduced compared to those people in the non-migrant, or I'm sorry, in the formal scenario group. So some brief takeaways. We've seen that migration intentions are certainly influenced by migration channels that are available to potential migrants. Again, this is all hypothetical, but I'll talk a little bit about where we hope to take this in the future. but our results indicate that informal migration is much less desirable than the formal migration scenario, all else being equal. So our headline results suggest people prefer formal opportunities where they're available. However, not all potential international migrants are deterred by the informal scenario. So this emphasizes the need for a policy focus on supporting formal migration channels as much as is possible. So some next steps, of course, again, this is hypothetical. We're eliciting beliefs and intentions at this stage with a relatively small sample size. We're hoping to take this into the realm of reality and match migration beliefs and intentions with actual migration behavior. And so we're working with and continuing to speak with the Ministry of Labor and Skills to develop this follow-up work. As many of you may be aware, there's a recent government initiative which emphasizes and promotes safe and inclusive migration, particularly to the Gulf region, but other regions as well. And we hope to conduct an RCT that provides evidence on impacts of this initiative on migrant workers and also their families. Interestingly, with this initiative, we are confident we can collect stepwise dynamics, which is an understudied feature of migration. And so the way we're able to do this is that when people, as we understand it, approach the one-stop shop centers to register their desire to move abroad, they come from all over Ethiopia to do this in a central location in Addis. Of course, there are some OSSCs we understand in other parts of Ethiopia, but being a large urban center with many of these OSSCs, migrants come from all over. So we can capture the movement from rural to urban, the stepwise migration, and then urban to international, as was alluded to in a previous presentation. So to wrap up, while we're seeking funding for the baseline survey, we're continuing to have these conversations to ensure this research is not only timely, but relevant to overall policy goals. So with that, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Timing was just perfect. So let's take one round of questions. We have about 10-15 minutes for questions now. Let's open up for questions. If you have any questions, just raise your hands and you'll get a microphone. And our two speakers will do the best to answer those questions. I guess it's the end of a long and tiring day, but I suspect there may be a couple of burning questions. I have at least two, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Tewodros and Anne, just for the interesting presentation. Yeah, my question is just to the first presenter, to Dr. Tewodros. I think the idea of creating green and resilient jobs is really interesting idea. But my big concern is related to the implementation of this kind of to the implementation of this kind of projects. Like, for example, in countries like Ethiopia, where market failure is pervasive, and institutions that regulate environmental negative externalities are either non-existent or very weak. Do you think that it's somehow feasible to promote jobs? To induce firms in order to create green jobs and also upgrade their technologies so that they are environmentally friendly. And in the literature, there are different ways of encouraging or maybe pushing firms or producers to use environmentally friendly technologies, including maybe the cost area where we don't know the property right, whether the property right is on the producer side or on the other side. Or we have also another, theory, including another traditional policies like the Pigovian tax, where those who negatively contribute to the environment should be taxed. So yeah, we do have like also other incentives and also punishments in order to regulate like firms in order to adopt environmentally friendly technologies. But yeah, my overall concern is that do we have like this kind of institutions in order to promote this kind of green and resilient jobs? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next question, I think we have one here. Giulio, to the left, number 3.
Thank you. My question is a follow-up of the morning's one about Dr. Tewodros.
Can you speak a bit closer to the microphone, just?
Okay. How about now?
Perfect.
Thank you. It is about firms, impact of firms in terms of climate impact on climate, opportunity for quality jobs, their impact also on the agriculture sector as well. I said firms is an upgrade, or we will have new firms being created, particularly through FDI. When we look into growth, the most focus is being given currently actually towards industrialization, because it's about linkage of the various industry. In addition to expanding the sectors, the still focus area is about the value addition, about manufacturing, and manufacturing will have significant impact on migration as well from rural to nodal cities, and also on the even composition of the manufacturing is going to change from most labor intensive to technology and capital intensive industry. So this has a wide range of impact on climate, on job creation, on environment as well. Currently, I am aware that Ministry of Industry is trying to design an incentive mechanism to induce, climate and green investments. And most of the studies actually in the papers that are presented today, I think they are very much relevant is for existing policies or the policies that are being designed. So my advice or my recommendation is that I think particularly on firms, advise that I recommend the IGC work closely with Ministry of Industry so that whatever being done there at the ministry is aligned and it is policy responsive in terms of you, so that it will add more value, and even you will have more of an information as to particularly the 10 years growth plan is very much relevant. So that's my suggestion. Otherwise, I think thank you for inviting me, and also I really enjoyed all of the presentation because they are very much relevant. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is one of those fantastic cases where question number 2 kind of start answering question number 1. So we will save a little bit on time there. So what are the institutions? Ministry of Industry, maybe one. There is Giulio, and then there is a final question there, and then I'll pass the. Oh no, there are 5 questions. So quickly, one, yes.
Thank you, both the presenters, for the brief and very interesting presentation. So I have just one question for Dr. Tewodros, and my question is like, do you think that to shift the farmers from the traditional sectors which they have been engaged on to the sectors that can be shift to the creating green jobs? Like, do we need to have awareing them or nudging them through different mechanisms, or maybe incentivizing or subsidizing them until so I like my concern is it does be possible just to make them move from the traditional sector which they are been working on to the greener ones. Thank you.
Fantastic. Next, there is Giulio, and finally, back.
Okay, thanks so much for those very interesting presentations. I have a question for Teddy, Tewodros. So you mentioned cap and trade as a potential policy to think about for different industries. And I guess my question is two parts. What sectors were you potentially already thinking about? And what are your thoughts? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, what are your thoughts on monitoring technologies to implement those cap and trade systems, given that, especially say, in conversations around cap and trade for the livestock sector, we currently don't have very effective monitoring technology to make those type of policies implementable. And then Anna also had a couple of comments and two questions and a comment. The first question I had was whether on the previous migrants, whether you collected data on their reasons for coming back and what was the sort of primary reasons for returning. On the whole sample, I was curious to understand whether you collected data on the occupation that they were expecting to work in. And related to that, there is my comment, which is, I wonder if you already thought about, there is this literature on misinformation in labor markets about workers' own comparative advantage. Some recent experimental work in South Africa providing information both to firms and workers about the comparative advantages they have in the labor market, finding that workers do not necessarily know ex ante what is their best skill that they are competent at and how that could potentially create a better match. So I'm wondering whether you thought about potentially providing this type of information in addition to your treatments in sort of future work. So thanks a lot.
Final question at the back.
Thank you very much for both presenters. Interesting insights. I think some of them will go back to policy too, especially what Dr. Tewodros mentioned, referenced from teachers and accountants at the end. Are we training more accountants or not? So it might go back to educational policies and the like. So I'm just, I'm glad that these insights are coming out. My question, either one of you can answer it, is that we see a trend and also a push from the government too regarding gig workers. Gig workers, and the possibilities are there, and some areas the availability of work is there. Giving that the skill gap and upbringing of upscaling of skills is a question on another note. My interest is more on informal sector. When Dr. Tewodros was presenting from firms and on the 3 lines that you presented, I was not able to, if I missed it, you'll correct me. The informal sector, pretty much a very big number of people are small scale income generating schemes. So I really wonder how these things are going to be combined, and in the further studies, if you plan to go further in that area. Recently, we took part in doing a research on the gig economies in major cities in Ethiopia. So some insights are out there. So maybe we can overlap some of the insights that might inform the future data collection. But thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge that.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for these questions. I'll start with Eddie. I'll have a super quick clarificatory question. When you talked about migration cost, Anne, can you just clarify whether you're referring to monetary or also somehow you're quantifying the cost to some of the personal safety risks? Because that seems to be the focus of the RCT. But
Thank you so much. It seems my presentation was more popular than I initially anticipated, because as I said initially, the purpose is to really get as much information. So I'll just lump 3 of the questions in one because we don't have time, and that is that's regarding sort of the skepticism or the pessimism of whether incentives systems would actually work. So I think here, and incidentally, this is one of the subjects of one of my PhD papers back, and this was recently published, and that is the effectiveness of policy, industrial policy, particularly in incentivizing firms. And of course, in the past, incentives have not been effective as we would like them to be to induce firms, but there are a lot of factors for it. One of the factors has to do with targeting. One of the factors has to be combined with other policy issues, but that does not necessarily mean that incentives do not work, right? So there is a nuance to incentivizing. We have to sort of own our skills of creating incentives to firms. We don't have other choice. Policies about incentives. If we like private enterprises, if they want them to produce, if we want them to channel resources in a certain way, incentives are, we don't have much choice. So this is within that spectrum. There are a lot of failures, market failures in others, but I strongly believe that we can come up with a better system of incentivizing, targeted incentive, a smart way of incentivizing that could result. And again, climate also falls in that sort of line. Thank you for the interventions for the colleague from the Ministry of Industry. I think the new industrial policy, I was involved in reviewing that. It's not sufficiently sort of green in the new emerging sort of way, but there is room for the policy is more general, and there are regulations, directives that could come out to really provide for those incentives, and it's in line with the 10-year development plan. Definitely, we will take your recommendation to engage in that aspect. So the cap and trade, we did not have, this was not a recommendation at all. We're just throwing the idea away and say, what do we need for us to have these kinds of, is it Pigouvian tax, as Halefom said, is it Pigouvian taxes that we need to do versus cap and trade? What are the choices that we have? So all of the points very well taken. On the on the gig worker question that Mahader raised, there is we're talking about a very small proportion of the population, right? 50% of the population does not have electricity. Even, I don't know if perhaps 15-20% has access to internet or other services. So we are really increasingly focusing on a very small proportion of our population. But we have to really think big in trying to solve our basic problems of basic education, primary education, getting skills at that level, to ensure that we have a labor force that is ready to accept, to benefit from the technological progress that's out there. By far, I think we are in the first question way back. So thank you so much for the.
Thank you for the quick question. So Julio, for yours, we unfortunately did not ask reason for coming back to the sample of previous migrants, nor their occupation. We also didn't ask if they had originally gone through formal or informal means, and so we plan to do that in the RCT because that is super important and interesting information. And then regarding the misinformation regarding comparative advantage literature, a little bit familiar with it, but I think it would fit really well in thinking about how to structure our RCT. So thank you for that. And then migration costs, I should have been more precise. Those were financial costs. So we asked about what kind of costs the migrant would expect to incur, and then we capture the non-financial costs in the well-being and work satisfaction indices that I had mentioned. So yeah, thank you.
Fabulous. Okay, that takes us to the end of a super interesting final session. Thank you so much for our presenters. Maybe let's give them an applause. And I don't know, Sene, whether you want to now introduce the very final closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Stefan.